252 million years ago, life on Earth almost ended. Not metaphorically, not as a dramatic phrase scientists use for effect. Nearly everything alive on this planet disappeared. The oceans emptied first. Entire seafloors that had been crowded with life for millions of years became graveyards of shells and bacterial slime. Forests collapsed, food chains failed, and for a period so long that evolution itself seemed to stall, the planet remained nearly silent. 96% of all species vanished, and unlike the extinction that killed the dinosaurs, nothing arrived from space to cause it. No asteroid, no impact crater. The thing that nearly sterilized the Earth came from beneath it. In what is now Siberia, the ground split open, not for a day, not for a century, for nearly 1 million years. Lava flooded across the landscape in sheets so large they reshaped continents. But the lava was only the beginning. The atmosphere itself started changing. The oceans warmed, acidified, and slowly lost oxygen. The sky filled with toxic gases. Temperatures swung violently between volcanic winters and runaway greenhouse heat. And somewhere inside all of that, a handful of species survived. What happened during those million years was so extreme that the Earth that emerged afterward was no longer the same planet that existed before it. Entire ecosystems disappeared permanently. Dominant animal groups that had ruled for tens of millions of years were erased almost completely. The age that followed belonged to different creatures entirely. Tonight, we are going back to the closest life on Earth has ever come to total extinction. But before we do, let me know in the comments, are you listening to this to fall asleep, or you're here only for the knowledge? Now, let's descend into the volcanic catastrophe scientists call the Great Dying. Long before mammals lifted their heads into cold morning air, before birds crossed the sky, or flowers opened toward the sun, the earth carried a different silence. The continents had not yet scattered into familiar shapes. They were locked together in a single immense body called Pangaea, a continent so vast that weather itself struggled to cross it. Around this enormous landmass stretched Panthalassa, a world ocean circling the planet like dark blue glass. Near the center of Pangaea, the land was dry beyond modern comparison. Moisture from the distant coasts rarely reached the interior. Wind moved over plains of stone and red sand for hundreds of kilometers without interruption. Seasonal heat baked the ground until riverbeds cracked into hard geometric patterns. In some regions, dunes migrated slowly across the landscape, burying older layers beneath waves of dust that moved with geological patience. Yet the edges of this supercontinent held another world entirely. Along the coastlines, rivers carried minerals into shallow inland seas, warmed by equatorial sunlight. Dense forests spread through humid lowlands, where giant club mosses and seed ferns rooted themselves in dark soil. Insects moved through thick vegetation beneath towering canopies, while amphibians rested beside marshes crowded with primitive reeds and horsetails. The dominant animals on land were the synapsids, distant relatives of the mammalian line that would emerge far in the future. They carried bodies unlike anything alive today, assembled from combinations evolution would never repeat. Some walked low to the ground with sprawling limbs, while others stood taller, moving with surprising speed across open terrain. Among them were the gorgonopsids, predators with elongated skulls and curved canine teeth that projected past their jaws even when their mouths were closed. The largest species approached the size of modern hippos, though leaner and built for pursuit rather than grazing. Their eyes faced forward, fixed on movement across dusty floodplains where prey wandered between sparse vegetation. Not far from them, lived the dicynodonts, heavy herbivores with beaked mouths and thick bodies, adapted for processing tough plant matter. They became one of the most successful animal groups of the Permian world, spreading across huge regions of Pangaea in enormous numbers. Their fossils would later appear on continents now separated by oceans, quiet evidence that those lands had once been joined together. Beyond the shoreline, the seas carried a richness that had been accumulating for tens of millions of years. Rugose corals and tabulate corals constructed reef systems beneath warm, shallow water where fish drifted through forests of branching limestone. Brachiopods covered the seafloor in dense colonies. Trilobites, already ancient even then, still persisted in scattered marine habitats after surviving earlier extinctions that had erased countless other forms of life. Ammonoids moved through open water in slow spirals, their chambered shells catching light beneath the surface. Entire ecosystems layered themselves across reefs, mudflats, estuaries, and continental shelves with extraordinary stability. Predator and prey, scavenger and grazer, reef and forest, all existed within patterns refined across roughly 50 million years of uninterrupted evolution. For a very long time, the planet seemed settled into those rhythms. Then, beneath northern Pangaea, pressure began gathering in the deep earth below Siberia. From high above northern Siberia, the land appears strangely geometric. Dark plateaus stretch toward the horizon in broad terraces, their edges descending in long stair-like layers carved by rivers and ancient ice. The shape gave the region its name. Traps comes from the Swedish word trappa, meaning stairs, a quiet description for one of the largest volcanic events the Earth has ever carried. Nothing about the Siberian traps resembles the image most people imagine when they hear the word volcano. There was no towering cone rising above the landscape, no singular mountain venting ash into the atmosphere. No crater formed at the center because there was no center. The eruptions emerged from immense fractures in the crust itself, spreading across the land through countless openings scattered over enormous distances. Geologists place the Siberian traps within a category called a large igneous province, a phrase that sounds almost administrative beside the scale it describes. These provinces form when material from deep within the mantle reaches the surface in extraordinary quantities, not as isolated eruptions, but as continent-sized outpourings of magma. The crust ceases to behave like a solid barrier and instead becomes a thin shell, leaking heat from the planet's interior. At its greatest extent, the affected region covered roughly 7 million square kilometers, an area comparable to the continental United States and Western Europe combined. Much of that original surface has vanished beneath erosion, tectonic movement, and the slow rearrangement of continents over 252 million years. Even so, solidified basalt still blankets nearly 2 million square kilometers of Siberia today, preserving fragments of the ancient flows in black stone ridges and layered cliffs. The volume of erupted material remains almost difficult to visualize in physical terms. Estimates range between 1 and 4 million cubic kilometers of lava. Modern eruptions provide only fragile comparisons. Mount St. Helens, whose 1980 eruption entered global memory through photographs of ash clouds and collapsing forests, released approximately 1 cubic kilometer of material. The Siberian traps produced the equivalent of millions of such eruptions, though not in dramatic, isolated explosions. The Earth released them gradually, pulse after pulse, across nearly 1 million years. Some lava flows spread outward for hundreds of kilometers before cooling. Rivers vanished beneath advancing basalt. Valleys filled and disappeared. Entire landscapes were buried beneath molten rock, that hardened into new terrain. In certain regions, successive flows stacked atop one another until the basalt reached thicknesses measured in kilometers, each layer preserving a separate eruptive chapter within the dark stone. There were pauses between these episodes. Centuries may have passed in relative quiet, intervals where vegetation crept back across cooling surfaces and surviving ecosystems adjusted to altered climates. Then another eruptive pulse arrived, sending fresh lava across older basalt plains and releasing new volumes of gas into the atmosphere. The pattern repeated again and again, not as a single catastrophe, but as a prolonged geological rhythm unfolding beyond the scale of human history. Today, the remaining plateaus stand silent beneath snow, tundra, and boreal forest. Beneath their surfaces rests the hardened memory of a planet opening itself from within. Far beneath the forests, deserts, and shallow seas of the Permian world, the mantle moved with immense slowness. Rock there was not liquid in the ordinary sense. It remained solid, yet under the pressure and heat of the deep earth, it behaved like something softer, flowing over spans of time so large they dissolved the distinction between motion and stillness. Within that depth, a plume of unusually hot mantle material began rising toward the crust. It traveled upward over millions of years, carrying heat from regions far below the continents. By the time it approached the underside of northern Pangaea, around 252 to 253 million years ago, the surface above remained unaware. Rivers continued their seasonal paths. Synapsids crossed floodplains beneath dry winds. Reef systems filtered sunlight through warm marine water. The crust waiting above the plume was ancient even by Permian standards. Much of Siberia rested on Precambrian rock, formed billions of years earlier. Thick continental crust enriched with silica and compressed through vanished mountain building events long before complex animals existed. It was rigid, dense, and deeply rooted into the mantle below. As the rising plume reached the base of this crust, it could move no higher at first. Instead, it spread sideways beneath the continent, flattening outward like pressure beneath ice. Heat accumulated against the lower crust, weakening minerals and widening old fractures buried within the rock. Over time, the continent began to stretch, not visibly at first, but in slow microscopic shifts repeated across enormous distances. Then the crust started to break. Long fissures opened across Siberia in branching networks that extended for thousands of kilometers. These were not singular ruptures, but parallel systems of cracks, some narrow, others wide enough to channel enormous volumes of molten basalt upward from below. The Earth did not produce a mountain because the magma was emerging everywhere at once, distributed through countless openings spread across the continent. The earliest eruptions arrived quietly compared with the explosive eruptions of modern stratovolcanoes. Basaltic lava contains relatively little silica, which allows gases to escape more easily rather than building pressure inside sealed chambers. Instead of detonating upward, the magma poured outward in dark fluid sheets that moved steadily across the landscape. At times, the lava advanced fast enough to cover many kilometers in a single day, filling valleys, surrounding hills, and hardening into fresh basalt plains. Certain eruptive pulses may have produced flows hundreds of meters thick. Individual episodes buried regions comparable in size to modern European countries beneath molten rock. Forests disappeared beneath advancing basalt before fully burning. Lakes flashed into steam where lava crossed them. Sediment layers accumulated over tens of millions of years vanished beneath new volcanic stone laid down within weeks or months. Beneath the surface, magma continued forcing itself through deep fractures called dikes, and horizontal chambers known as sills, extending the volcanic system farther outward through the crust. The fissures multiplied gradually until Siberia became threaded with underground conduits carrying heat from the mantle into the upper earth. What emerged was not a single volcanic wound, but an entire province of fractures opening together beneath an already fragile world, each one carrying the deep interior of the planet toward the surface in slow, relentless currents of fire. The basalt spreading across Siberia changed the surface of the earth, but stone alone could not reach every coastline, every forest basin, every distant sea. The deeper transformation traveled invisibly through the atmosphere itself. Each fresh outpouring of lava carried dissolved gases upward from the mantle, releasing them into the sky in quantities the biosphere had never experienced before. Volcanic plumes drifted across the supercontinent, carrying sulfur dioxide, carbon dioxide, hydrogen chloride, hydrogen fluoride, and carbon monoxide. These substances spread far beyond the fissures that produced them. Winds carried them over mountain ranges, across inland deserts, and out above Panthalassa, where they mingled with clouds and ocean mist. The eruptions altered not only the land beneath them, but the chemistry of the air surrounding the entire planet. Carbon dioxide accumulated gradually across the long duration of the eruptions. Over roughly 1 million years, the Siberian Traps may have released as much as 170,000 gigatons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. The number exists far beyond ordinary human scale. It represents enough carbon to reshape planetary temperature systems, ocean chemistry, rainfall patterns, and atmospheric circulation simultaneously. Yet the first climatic effects were not warming. Sulfur dioxide rising into the upper atmosphere combined with water vapor to form sulfuric acid aerosols, microscopic droplets capable of reflecting sunlight back into space. During intense eruptive phases, sunlight reaching the surface diminished beneath a haze suspended high above the planet. Temperatures dropped rapidly, growing seasons shortened, regional climates shifted within spans of time too brief for ecosystems to adjust smoothly. Eventually, those aerosols settled out of the atmosphere through rain and gravity, leaving the longer lived carbon dioxide behind. Then the balance reversed. Heat that would normally radiate back into space became trapped within the lower atmosphere and oceans. The planet entered periods of greenhouse warming that persisted far longer than the temporary volcanic cooling. Geological evidence suggests these transitions repeated many times through the eruptive era, producing unstable swings between colder and hotter conditions instead of a single steady trend. Rain itself became chemically altered. Hydrogen chloride and hydrogen fluoride dissolved into atmospheric moisture, returning to the surface as acidic precipitation. Freshwater systems absorbed these compounds first. Rivers carried them through floodplains and wetlands, changing soil chemistry and damaging plant tissues at the base of terrestrial food webs. Minerals essential for long-term fertility washed away from exposed ground, while toxic elements became more concentrated in lakes and shallow inland seas. Along coastlines, the changing chemistry of the atmosphere reached organisms that depended on calcium carbonate to build shells and skeletal structures. Marine invertebrates formed their bodies from minerals now increasingly vulnerable to dissolution in acidified water. Reef systems that had developed across immense stretches of geological time began encountering conditions hostile to their continued growth. The atmosphere itself became erratic and difficult for complex ecosystems to endure. Oxygen levels fluctuated. Temperatures lurched between volcanic cooling and greenhouse heat. Seasonal stability weakened. Weather systems reorganized beneath skies, carrying unfamiliar chemical burdens from the deep earth. What emerged above the Permian world was not simply polluted air, but an atmosphere gradually drifting outside the narrow boundaries within which most complex life had evolved. Deep beneath the volcanic provinces of Permian Siberia rested the compressed remains of far older worlds. Ancient forests had once grown there through humid ages long before the supercontinent reached its final shape. Swamps accumulated layer upon layer of fallen vegetation, slowly buried beneath sediment and pressure until the carbon rich remains became immense coal deposits stretching across vast regions underground. Mixed among them were thick beds of evaporites, mineral formations left behind by vanished inland seas. Salt, gypsum, and carbonate rocks had settled out of ancient water under dry climates and slow evaporation, building subterranean layers over spans of time so long they became part of the continental foundation itself. When magma from the Siberian Traps forced its way upward through the crust, it encountered these buried deposits directly. The molten rock did not merely pass beside them. It intruded into the coal seams and evaporite layers through underground chambers called sills, spreading laterally between older rock strata while carrying enormous heat into surrounding sediments. The transformation that followed occurred mostly out of sight. Coal exposed to such temperatures did not always ignite into open flame. Instead, it underwent contact metamorphism, a quieter but equally profound process in which surrounding rock baked under extreme heat and released trapped volatile compounds into the atmosphere. Carbon, long locked underground, escaped back into circulation as gas. Additional carbon dioxide poured upward through fractures opened by the intruding magma. Methane, far more efficient at trapping heat than carbon dioxide over shorter periods, entered the atmosphere in enormous pulses. Other thermogenic gases formed as organic material decomposed under pressure and heat deep within the crust. Much of this output would never have existed through volcanism alone. The Siberian eruptions had intersected one of the largest buried carbon reservoirs on Earth and awakened it. Some estimates suggest the interaction between magma and these underground deposits may have doubled or even tripled the total greenhouse gas release associated with the eruptions. The atmosphere was no longer receiving only mantle derived emissions. It was also absorbing the carbon accumulated from hundreds of millions of years of ancient biological activity, suddenly liberated through geological violence. Far from Siberia, another source of instability began responding to the warming oceans. Along portions of the seafloor, methane existed frozen within icy crystal structures called hydrates. These deposits remain stable only under particular combinations of pressure and temperature. As ocean waters warmed, some of those hydrates may have destabilized and released additional methane upward through marine sediments in abrupt bursts, sometimes described as clathrate gun events. The climate system became layered with interacting feedbacks. Warming triggered methane release. Methane intensified warming. Heat altered ocean chemistry and circulation, which in turn affected the stability of still more buried carbon stores. The atmosphere gradually shifted further away from the conditions under which the Permian biosphere had evolved. What unfolded beneath Siberia was therefore more than a volcanic episode in the ordinary sense. The eruptions intersected a geological archive of combustible material assembled over immense stretches of Earth history. Coal beds, evaporites, thermogenic gases, and destabilized seafloor methane combined with volcanic emissions into a single expanding chemical cascade. By the time those processes fully intertwined, the atmosphere above the planet had become shaped not only by the mantle below, but by the release of ancient carbon once hidden safely within the Earth itself. In the shallow tropical seas of the late Permian, life had once arranged itself into dense and intricate communities. Reef systems rose from warm continental shelves. Shell-bearing animals covered the seafloor in vast living layers. Water moved slowly through coral branches, while ammonoids drifted above them in open currents, their spiral shells turning beneath filtered sunlight. These oceans had supported uninterrupted biological complexity for tens of millions of years. Then the chemistry of the water began to change. Carbon dioxide released into the atmosphere did not remain there alone. The oceans absorbed enormous quantities of it, drawing the gas downward through the surface and into the upper layers of seawater. Once dissolved, the carbon dioxide reacted with water molecules and formed carbonic acid. The shift seems subtle when written chemically, yet across planetary oceans it altered the stability of marine life itself. Many Permian organisms depended on calcium carbonate to build shells, skeletons, and reef frameworks. As ocean acidity increased, those mineral structures became progressively more difficult to maintain. Some organisms struggled to grow, others formed thinner shells that fractured more easily. In the most chemically stressed regions, calcium carbonate began dissolving directly into seawater, weakening reef systems from within. The reefs disappeared almost entirely from the fossil record after the extinction. For roughly 10 million years, complex reef ecosystems remained absent from the oceans, leaving behind a strange silence in marine sediments where vibrant biological architecture had once flourished continuously across the planet. At the same time, the warming atmosphere altered the physical behavior of seawater itself. Warm water carries less dissolved oxygen than cold water. As ocean temperatures rose, oxygen concentrations declined across broad marine regions. Normal circulation patterns also weakened. Under stable conditions, colder, dense water sinks near the poles and carries oxygen into the deep ocean through slow planetary circulation. During the Great Dying, that exchange faltered. The deep ocean gradually became stagnant in many places. Oxygen-poor regions spread outward through continental shelves and abyssal basins until enormous marine dead zones developed beneath the surface. Modern geologists still find evidence of these suffocating waters preserved as dark black shales rich in carbon and lacking signs of oxygen-dependent life. Temperature intensified every other pressure already building through the seas. Tropical surface waters may have approached 40 degrees Celsius during the peak warming intervals, conditions close to the upper thermal limits tolerated by many complex marine organisms. Species adapted over millions of years to relatively stable climates found themselves living in water increasingly difficult to oxygenate, chemically hostile to shell formation, and persistently overheated. Ancient groups that had endured earlier extinction events finally vanished. Trilobites, survivors from oceans older than forests on land, disappeared completely after enduring nearly 270 million years of planetary upheaval. Brachiopods declined from hundreds of species into only a small remnant of survivors. Ammonoids came close to total extinction as well, though a few lineages persisted in scattered refuges and later expanded again across Triassic seas. The marine collapse did not unfold in a single synchronized moment. The dying arrived in pulses, corresponding to renewed volcanic activity and shifting climate conditions. Ecosystems already weakened by warming and acidification encountered repeated disruptions before recovery could stabilize them. Each interval of stress narrowed the possibilities for survival a little further. Over time, the oceans became quieter, less diverse, and increasingly dominated by absence where complexity had once lived continuously beneath the Permian sun. Across the interior of Pangaea, the seasons lost their old rhythms. Rain arrived irregularly or not at all. In other intervals, acidic storms crossed the continent and fell onto floodplains already weakened by heat and drought. Rivers carried dissolved chemicals through valleys where vegetation had once stabilized the soil, and the ground itself slowly began losing the ability to support complex ecosystems. The terrestrial extinction was less complete than the devastation in the oceans, yet it remained immense. Roughly 70% of land vertebrate species disappeared, along with most insect groups that had occupied the Permian world for millions of years. Entire ecological relationships vanished together. Predators lost prey. Pollinating insects disappeared beside the plants they depended upon. Food chains that had developed gradually over geological time unraveled within comparatively brief intervals. Among the vanished were the gorgonopsids, the dominant predators of late Permian landscapes. Their long skulls and saber-like canine teeth had once marked them as apex hunters across enormous regions of Pangaea. They left no descendants behind. After surviving climatic shifts and continental changes through earlier ages, the lineage ended completely during the Great Dying. The dicynodonts fared slightly better. Small pockets of survivors endured into the Triassic world, carrying forward a diminished remnant of a group that had once spread widely across the supercontinent. Yet even they never fully recovered. Their later extinction would arrive quietly beside the rise of newer animal lineages better suited to altered environments. The forests suffered perhaps the deepest transformation of all. Coal deposits form only under particular conditions, where dense vegetation accumulates in stable wetlands over long spans of time before burial. After the extinction boundary, those deposits vanish almost entirely from the geological record for roughly 5 to 10 million years, a phenomenon paleontologists call the coal gap. The absence carries enormous meaning. It suggests that forest ecosystems collapsed across much of the planet. Without stable forests, soils eroded more easily beneath rainfall and wind. Nutrient cycles weakened. River systems carried sediment into lakes and coastal environments where murky water further disrupted surviving aquatic habitats. The fossil record preserves another strange signal from this interval. At extinction boundary layers across multiple continents, fungal spores appear suddenly in extraordinary abundance. Many researchers interpret this fungal spike as evidence of widespread decomposition occurring simultaneously on a planetary scale. Vast quantities of dead plant matter and animal remains may have created temporary conditions favorable to fungi feeding on collapsing ecosystems. Even the carbon cycle on land appeared destabilized. Carbon isotope patterns preserved in ancient soil. Carbonates suggest normal biological exchange between atmosphere, vegetation, and soil weakened dramatically during the peak extinction interval. The terrestrial biosphere no longer processed carbon in its usual balanced rhythm. The system flattened into something simpler and less productive. Acid rain intensified the decline. Hydrogen chloride and hydrogen fluoride carried through the atmosphere returned repeatedly to the surface, damaging leaves, acidifying rivers, and stripping essential minerals from exposed ground. Young plants struggled to establish themselves in depleted soils, while surviving vegetation endured alternating intervals of extreme warmth and volcanic cooling. Large regions of Earth gradually became sparse and unstable landscapes where recovery remained difficult. Vegetation thinned. Water systems turned chemically harsh. Dust crossed open terrain once anchored by forests. Life persisted in scattered refuges, but much of the supercontinent entered a prolonged ecological exhaustion beneath skies altered by the distant eruptions still continuing far to the north. A thin seam of pale rock in southern China carries one of the sharpest boundaries in Earth's history. Above it, the fossil record changes abruptly. Shell beds, rich with complex marine life, narrow into sparse sediments where diversity nearly disappears. The transition occupies only a narrow interval of stone, yet inside that compressed layer rests the collapse of the Permian world. For decades, scientists debated how quickly the extinction unfolded. Early interpretations imagined a long decline spread across millions of years, with ecosystems gradually weakening beneath volcanic stress and climate instability. Geological time often obscures sudden events. Sediment accumulates slowly, continents shift, and rock layers merge into broad spans that make catastrophes appear smoother than they truly were. The development of high precision radiometric dating changed that picture completely. Tiny zircon crystals, preserved within volcanic ash layers, became the key to reconstructing the timing of the extinction in extraordinary detail. Zircons form during volcanic eruptions and incorporate uranium atoms into their crystal structures while excluding lead. Over immense spans of time, the uranium decays into lead at a fixed and measurable rate, allowing scientists to calculate the age of the crystal with remarkable precision. The measurements required an almost delicate level of accuracy. Laboratories analyzed isotope ratios at concentrations approaching parts per trillion, among the most technically demanding procedures in modern geology. A minute contamination, invisible to the eye, could distort the result by thousands of years. Through repeated refinements, researchers gradually narrowed the timeline surrounding the extinction boundary. What emerged from those studies was startling. The principal extinction pulse now appears to have occurred within roughly 60,000 years. Some evidence suggests the most catastrophic interval in the oceans may have unfolded in as little as 10,000 to 20,000 years. Within geological time, that span is almost instantaneous. It is shorter than the interval separating the modern world from the end of the last glacial maximum. The speed matters because ecosystems respond differently to gradual change than to sudden disruption. Species can often adapt to slow environmental shifts occurring across many generations. Populations migrate. Genetic variation spreads through breeding populations over time. Food webs reorganize themselves slowly enough to preserve continuity. The late Permian biosphere encountered something far faster. Ocean chemistry changed within intervals, too brief for many marine organisms to adjust physiologically. Atmospheric composition fluctuated, while temperatures lurched between cooling volcanic aerosols and greenhouse warming. Forest systems fragmented before stable recovery could occur. Habitats transformed more quickly than many species could expand into new regions or evolve new tolerances. Creatures that had survived earlier extinctions across hundreds of millions of years suddenly faced overlapping environmental pressures delivered almost simultaneously. Acidification weakened shell-forming organisms, while oxygen levels declined through warming oceans. Terrestrial ecosystems endured unstable rainfall, poisoned soils, and repeated climate swings before biological communities could stabilize between eruptive phases. The fossil record preserves this compression in unsettling silence. Diverse assemblages vanish within layers of rock thin enough to fit beneath a human hand. Ancient lineages that had persisted through continental rearrangements and earlier climatic upheavals disappear with abrupt finality. From sediments deposited over spans, geologically brief enough to resemble a single, violent interruption. The Permian extinction was not a slow fading of life beneath background stress. The planet changed faster than many ecosystems could follow, and the living world encountered those changes all at once. In certain cliffs and quarry walls around the world, the end of the Permian period can be touched with a fingertip. A narrow band of rock separates two different biological worlds. Below it lies stone, crowded with the remains of flourishing ecosystems, shells layered over shells, burrows crossing ancient seafloors, traces of stable oceans that persisted for millions of years. Above it, the record changes abruptly into something sparse and subdued, as though the planet itself had fallen quiet. Geologists call this transition the Permian-Triassic boundary. It appears in outcrops scattered across distant continents, preserved in places such as Meishan in southern China, the mountains of Greenland, limestone sequences in Italy and Pakistan, and the broad sedimentary exposures of South Africa's Karoo Basin. These locations were once parts of entirely different environments, yet each carries the same unmistakable interruption in Earth's history. At Meishan, regarded as the global reference section for the extinction, the boundary can be seen clearly with the naked eye. Fossil-rich Permian limestone gives way to a thin, pale interval where biological complexity nearly vanishes. The change occupies only a small thickness of rock, but within that compressed layer rests the chemical memory of planetary collapse. Scientists learned to read those layers not only through fossils, but through the elements preserved inside them. Elevated concentrations of nickel appear repeatedly near the boundary, matching the geochemical fingerprint associated with Siberian basalt volcanism. The nickel likely traveled through the atmosphere, attached to volcanic emissions before settling into marine sediments thousands of kilometers away from the eruptions themselves. The rocks also contain stranger clues. In some boundary sections, researchers identified fullerenes, hollow carbon molecules, sometimes called buckyballs, containing trapped noble gases with unusual isotopic compositions. Early studies proposed that these gases might indicate extraterrestrial material delivered by an impact event. The interpretation remains debated, however, and later analyses failed to produce universally accepted confirmation of a large meteorite contribution to the extinction. Other signals proved more consistent. Carbon isotope measurements revealed a dramatic negative excursion at the boundary, meaning the ratio of carbon-13 to carbon-12 shifted suddenly toward lighter carbon. Such changes occur when enormous amounts of isotopically light carbon enter the atmosphere and oceans in a relatively short time. Volcanic emissions, thermogenic gases released from heated coal beds, and destabilized methane all fit that chemical pattern. Tiny traces of iridium also appear within some sections, though at concentrations far weaker than the famous boundary layer associated with the extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs 66 million years later. The signal exists, but not at levels expected from a massive asteroid impact capable of driving a global catastrophe on its own. The evidence instead continues pointing back toward volcanism and atmospheric disruption as the primary forces behind the extinction. The boundary rocks preserve more than biological absence. They preserve chemistry itself. Oxygen conditions, carbon cycling, volcanic emissions, ocean circulation, and atmospheric change all left measurable signatures embedded within minerals deposited during the crisis. Sediments became an archive of planetary instability, written not in language, but in isotopes, trace elements, and fossil disappearance. 252 million years later, scientists cut thin sections from those rocks, dissolve fragments in laboratories, and measure atoms invisible to the eye. From that work emerges a detailed reconstruction of the moment, when Earth's systems crossed into collapse and left their history pressed quietly into stone. Long after the lava cooled and the oceans recovered enough to carry life again, the eruptions left behind another trace, hidden inside ancient sediments. It is not dramatic when viewed in isolation. No fossil shape marks it. No visible scar separates it from surrounding rock. The clue exists instead as a subtle enrichment of a metallic element dispersed through stone deposited 252 million years ago. Mercury enters the atmosphere naturally during volcanic eruptions. Deep within magma, small amounts of the element remain dissolved until pressure decreases near the surface. Once released, mercury vapor rises into the atmosphere and spreads across enormous distances before eventually settling back onto land and sea. In marine environments, that fallout becomes incorporated into accumulating sediments, preserving a chemical memory of volcanic activity long after the eruptions themselves disappear from view. For many years, researchers studying the Permian extinction focused primarily on carbon isotopes, fossil disappearance, and evidence of oceanic oxygen loss. Then, a newer line of investigation began producing remarkably consistent results. Sedimentary layers near the Permian-Triassic boundary repeatedly showed unusual spikes in mercury concentration at locations distributed across the world. The signal appeared in China, Europe, the Arctic, Australia, and the Americas. Sites separated by ancient oceans and continental distances all carried the same pattern embedded within rocks formed during the extinction interval. The concentrations rose sharply near the boundary and then declined again above it, matching the timing expected from large-scale volcanic emissions. What proved especially revealing was the structure of the signal itself. The mercury did not appear as one smooth, uninterrupted increase. Instead, the concentrations rose and fell in pulses, suggesting repeated eruptive phases separated by quieter intervals. The pattern aligned closely with the episodic nature of the Siberian Traps volcanism reconstructed from lava sequences and radiometric dating. That pulsed structure strengthened the connection between the eruptions and the extinction. A single catastrophic event, such as a major asteroid impact, would likely produce a different geochemical fingerprint, concentrated within one narrow interval. The Mercury record instead resembled prolonged volcanic activity unfolding across multiple eruptive episodes, each one adding new material into the atmosphere and oceans. The discovery also expanded beyond the Permian crisis itself. Researchers soon identified similar mercury enrichments at several other extinction boundaries associated with large igneous provinces. Sediments connected to the end. Triassic extinction and other ancient environmental disruptions carried comparable volcanic mercury anomalies. The pattern suggested that these immense eruptive provinces may represent a recurring mechanism behind some of the largest biological collapses in Earth history. Among all known examples, the Siberian Trap signal remains the largest and most globally distributed. The scale of mercury deposition reflects the extraordinary magnitude of the eruptions and the atmospheric circulation systems that carried volcanic emissions around the planet during the extinction interval. In the modern world, mercury is usually discussed as an industrial pollutant released through coal, combustion, and mining. Yet within ancient rock, it serves another role entirely. It becomes a geological timestamp, a quiet atmospheric residue preserved across continents and oceans. By measuring those tiny concentrations in sediments formed hundreds of millions of years ago, scientists can reconstruct pulses of volcanism with remarkable precision. An invisible vapor once drifting through Permian skies still lingers faintly within the rocks, waiting for instruments sensitive enough to read its presence. After the worst phases of the extinction passed, the Earth did not immediately become vibrant again. The early Triassic landscape was sparse and unstable, populated not by flourishing ecosystems but by scattered survivors, enduring conditions that still drifted far from equilibrium. The great question left behind by the Permian collapse was no longer which species disappeared. The more revealing mystery lay in the small number that remained. Among them was a squat herbivorous synapsid called Lystrosaurus. It was not elegant or imposing. Roughly pig-sized, with a barrel-shaped body and short tusks projecting from a beaked mouth, it would eventually become the most abundant land vertebrate of the early Triassic world. In some fossil assemblages, Lystrosaurus represents as much as 95% of all terrestrial vertebrate remains, an astonishing dominance almost unknown in healthy ecosystems. Its success likely emerged from several quiet advantages rather than any singular superiority. Evidence suggests Lystrosaurus may have been capable of burrowing, retreating underground where temperatures remained more stable during periods of climatic instability. It also appears to have been a dietary generalist, able to consume a wide range of tough or low quality vegetation in landscapes where food sources had become unpredictable. Rapid reproduction and relatively short generation times may have allowed populations to recover more quickly after environmental shocks that eliminated slower breeding competitors. Other survivors shared similar traits. Small body size became increasingly advantageous in a damaged world. Smaller animals required less food, reproduced more rapidly, and could occupy marginal habitats too limited to sustain larger species. They endured scarcity more effectively simply because their biological demands were lower. Among the lineages that persisted in reduced numbers were early archosaurs. During the Permian, they had been minor components of terrestrial ecosystems, neither dominant nor especially diverse. Yet they survived the extinction bottleneck and later expanded into forms that would eventually include crocodilians, pterosaurs, and dinosaurs. Their future success began quietly inside a world where survival itself had become the primary evolutionary achievement. In the oceans, survival followed similar patterns. Certain bivalves and gastropods endured despite acidified waters and depleted oxygen levels. Some fish lineages persisted in isolated marine regions where environmental conditions remained temporarily tolerable. Organisms capable of surviving low oxygen concentrations or fluctuating chemistry possessed an unusual advantage during intervals when entire ocean basins became unstable. Paleontologists describe many of these habitats as refugia, pockets of relative stability surrounded by broader ecological collapse. Deep cold water may have sheltered marine organisms from extreme surface temperatures. Isolated valleys with dependable freshwater sources may have protected remnant terrestrial populations. Underground burrows offered thermal buffering against unstable climates and toxic atmospheric conditions. Species with narrow ecological specializations rarely survived for long. Organisms dependent on precise temperatures, specific prey, or tightly balanced habitats tended to disappear as those systems unraveled. Generalists endured more often because they could shift behavior, diet, or habitat when familiar conditions vanished. The pattern reveals something subtle about extinction itself. Survival during the Great Dying was not necessarily linked to intelligence, strength, or evolutionary complexity. Many dominant Permian groups vanished entirely despite millions of years of success. The organisms that persisted were often adaptable, opportunistic, and chemically tolerant, capable of enduring environmental instability without requiring ecosystems to remain stable around them. In the aftermath of the extinction, life continued not through perfection, but through flexibility within a planet still struggling to steady itself. Numbers. This large resist ordinary intuition. A million years drifts beyond the scale of memory, beyond civilization, beyond language itself. Human history occupies only a tiny fraction of that span. Written records cover several thousand years. Agriculture reaches back roughly 12,000. Entire empires rise and disappear in periods that barely register against a million-year backdrop. 1 million years ago, Homo sapiens did not yet exist. Even the genus Homo had only recently appeared in Africa, represented by early human relatives living in landscapes utterly disconnected from the modern world. Stone tools were crude and sparse. Fire had not yet become central to survival. Everything recognizable about human civilization still belonged to a future unimaginably distant. The Siberian Traps volcanism endured across approximately 40,000 human generations. It began long before any human ancestor looked upward and wondered about the stars, and it continued for longer than the entire evolutionary history of our species and its immediate relatives combined. The duration changes the character of the catastrophe completely. The eruptions were not one singular event unfolding over days or years. They became a geological age unto themselves, a prolonged interval during which the planet remained trapped inside recurring environmental stress. Within that immense span, the volcanic activity likely pulsed repeatedly. Vast eruptions spread across Siberia, then quieted temporarily before returning again. Between those intervals, ecosystems attempted partial recovery. Populations expanded cautiously into damaged habitats. Ocean chemistry stabilized slightly. Forests may have begun reclaiming barren ground in isolated regions. Then another eruptive phase arrived. Fresh lava intruded into buried sediments. More gases entered the atmosphere. Temperatures shifted again. Ocean oxygen levels declined once more. Each pulse interrupted biological recovery before stable ecosystems could fully re-establish themselves. The biosphere was forced into repeated cycles of collapse and incomplete rebuilding. Ecologists sometimes distinguish between pulse disturbances and press disturbances. Pulse disturbances are sudden events that strike quickly and then fade, allowing ecosystems time to recover afterward. Hurricanes, floods, and asteroid impacts belong to this category. Even severe destruction may eventually give way to regeneration once the stress ends. Press disturbances behave differently. They persist continuously across long intervals, maintaining environmental pressure without permitting full recovery. Organisms remain trapped inside unstable conditions for generation after generation. Adaptation becomes difficult because the baseline itself keeps shifting. The Siberian traps represented the ultimate press disturbance. For nearly a million years, volcanic gases continued entering the atmosphere. Ocean circulation remained unstable. Climate fluctuations repeatedly altered rainfall patterns, temperatures, and chemical balances. Entire evolutionary lineages existed only within this interval of planetary instability and disappeared before conditions normalized again. The duration also helps explain why recovery after the extinction proceeded so slowly. Ecosystems cannot rebuild efficiently while the forces destabilizing them remain active. Coral reefs, forests, and complex food webs require long periods of environmental consistency to reestablish themselves. The Siberian eruptions denied the planet that consistency for spans longer than human evolution itself. Seen from within a single human lifetime, a million years appears almost infinite. Seen from geological time, it becomes a prolonged atmospheric experiment conducted across an entire planet. The wound beneath Siberia remained open across ages, long enough for mountains to erode, coastlines to shift, and countless generations of surviving organisms to live and die beneath skies that never fully settled back into balance. The rocks left behind by the Permian extinction do not contain thermometers, yet they remember heat with remarkable precision. Inside fossil shells, carbonate minerals, and microscopic chemical bonds, ancient oceans preserved traces of temperature that survived for hundreds of millions of years beneath sediment and stone. Modern laboratories learned how to read those traces slowly, developing ways to reconstruct climates from atoms arranged long before mammals or flowering plants existed. One of the most important tools comes from oxygen isotopes. Oxygen exists in multiple forms, including oxygen 16 and the slightly heavier oxygen 18. Marine organisms building shells from seawater incorporate these isotopes in proportions influenced by temperature. Cooler water favors one ratio, warmer water another. By measuring those tiny shifts in fossil carbonates, scientists can estimate the temperature of oceans that vanished before the first dinosaurs appeared. Another technique, known as clumped isotope thermometry, examines how rare isotopes bond together inside carbonate minerals. The frequency of those bonds changes subtly with temperature. The method is delicate enough to resolve variations smaller than 1 degree Celsius in ancient rocks, transforming ordinary limestone into an archive of environmental change recorded at the molecular level. Across the Permian-Triassic boundary, those measurements reveal a dramatic warming event. Global temperatures rose approximately 8 to 10 degrees Celsius over intervals geologically brief enough to destabilize ecosystems worldwide. The increase did not unfold gently across immense ages. It arrived within tens of thousands of years, while atmospheric chemistry and ocean circulation were already under severe strain from volcanism. Tropical sea surface temperatures during the peak of the extinction may have reached between 36 and 40 degrees Celsius. Modern tropical oceans rarely sustain such warmth for extended periods. At those temperatures, many complex marine organisms approach their physiological limits. Metabolism accelerates while oxygen availability declines, placing enormous stress on animals already struggling against acidification and unstable chemistry. The warming was not smooth or continuous. Geological evidence suggests at least two major temperature spikes separated by shorter cooling intervals. Those temporary cool phases likely corresponded to sulfur-rich volcanic aerosols entering the atmosphere and reflecting sunlight back into space. Once the aerosols settled out, greenhouse gases accumulated again and temperatures climbed further. The planet oscillated between abrupt cooling and prolonged warming, preventing stable recovery. High-latitude regions experienced especially dramatic change. Polar and subpolar environments normally provide cooler refuges where species can retreat during warmer intervals. During the Great Dying, those refuges diminished as temperatures rose across nearly all climatic zones. Organisms adapted to cooler water or temperate conditions found fewer stable habitats remaining available. The comparison with modern warming appears quietly inside these measurements as well. Human-driven climate change has raised global temperatures approximately 1.2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. The Siberian Traps ultimately produced warming many times greater, though over longer intervals. Even so, the geological record demonstrates how profoundly atmospheric carbon can alter planetary systems when introduced faster than natural feedback mechanisms can compensate. What scientists recover from these ancient rocks is more than a sequence of numbers. The isotope record preserves the thermal biography of a world slipping beyond the environmental conditions under which its ecosystems evolved. Every oxygen atom locked inside those fossils carries a fragment of that history, a microscopic memory of seas gradually becoming too warm for much of the life they once supported. Far beneath the surface of the modern ocean, invisible rivers move slowly through darkness. Cold, dense water forms near the poles, sinks into the deep sea, and drifts across the planet over spans of centuries before rising again elsewhere. This process, known as thermohaline circulation, quietly distributes oxygen through the deep ocean and helps regulate the chemistry of marine ecosystems across Earth. The system depends on contrast. Polar water must remain significantly colder and denser than tropical water for deep circulation to continue efficiently. As long as that temperature difference persists, oxygen rich surface water sinks and renews the depths below. During the Great Dying, that balance began to fail. As volcanic greenhouse gases accumulated in the atmosphere, high latitude regions warmed dramatically. Polar oceans lost much of the density contrast that normally drives deep water formation. Without sufficient sinking cold water, circulation slowed. In some ocean basins, it may have nearly stalled altogether. The geological evidence for this collapse lies preserved in black shales deposited across wide areas of the ancient seafloor. These sediments are rich in organic carbon and formed under oxygen poor conditions where normal decomposition slowed dramatically. Their widespread appearance during the extinction interval suggests large portions of the deep ocean became stagnant and depleted of oxygen. A stagnant ocean changes the rules of survival. Bottom-dwelling organisms rely on the slow delivery of oxygen from surface circulation. When that supply weakens, entire habitats become uninhabitable, even if temperatures remain within tolerable ranges. Creatures adapted to stable deep sea conditions found themselves trapped in water, gradually losing the oxygen required for aerobic life. As oxygen disappeared, different microbial communities expanded into the vacant ecological space. Sulfate-reducing bacteria, organisms capable of surviving without oxygen, began producing hydrogen sulfide as a metabolic byproduct. Hydrogen sulfide is toxic to most complex life. In modern oceans, it forms in isolated oxygen, starved basins, and stagnant sediments. During the Permian extinction, some researchers believe it may have accumulated across vast regions of the ocean itself. This idea became known as the Canfield Ocean hypothesis, named after geochemist Donald Canfield. According to the hypothesis, anoxic oceans rich in hydrogen sulfide may have released toxic gas into the atmosphere along coastlines and shallow marine environments. In such a world, poisonous conditions would no longer remain confined beneath the waves. The chemistry of the deep ocean could begin influencing terrestrial ecosystems as well. Support for this possibility comes from biomarkers associated with green sulfur bacteria discovered in certain boundary sediments. These bacteria require both sunlight and hydrogen sulfide to survive. Their presence suggests sulfidic water may have risen high enough into the water column for light to penetrate, an indication that toxic conditions reached shallow marine environments rather than remaining isolated in the abyss. The oceans during the extinction interval therefore became unstable in several interconnected ways at once. They warmed, they acidified, oxygen circulation weakened, toxic chemistry spread upward through the water column. Marine ecosystems already stressed by temperature and acidification faced an additional threat emerging from microbial processes expanding within stagnant seas. What had once been a planetary system supporting immense biological diversity gradually transformed into something chemically hostile across enormous areas of the ocean. In places, survival depended not only on enduring heat or acidity, but on avoiding waters where the basic chemistry of respiration itself had begun to fail. High above the weather, above clouds and volcanic ash, a thin atmospheric shield normally absorbs much of the sun's ultraviolet radiation before it can reach the surface. The ozone layer is fragile in thickness, yet immense in importance. Without it, sunlight becomes chemically dangerous to living tissue, especially to cells exposed directly at the surface of land and sea. For many years, research into the Great Dying focused primarily on warming, acidification, oxygen loss, and toxic gases. More recently, another consequence of the Siberian eruptions emerged from the rock record, one written not in ocean chemistry, but in damaged reproductive cells preserved across ancient sediments. The Siberian Traps released enormous quantities of volcanic halogens into the atmosphere. Chlorine and bromine compounds escaped not only from magma itself, but also from coal and evaporite deposits heated by underground intrusions. Once these gases reached the stratosphere, they began interacting with ozone molecules through catalytic reactions similar to those associated with modern industrial chlorofluorocarbons. The chemistry is deceptively simple. A single chlorine atom can destroy many ozone molecules before becoming inactive. Under ordinary conditions, natural atmospheric systems balance these reactions. During the extinction interval, however, volcanic emissions may have overwhelmed that balance on a planetary scale. The evidence survives inside fossil spores and pollen grains recovered from Permian-Triassic boundary sediments. Under microscopes, many of these ancient reproductive structures appear twisted, malformed, asymmetrical, or damaged in ways strongly associated with ultraviolet radiation exposure. Their outer walls show irregular growth patterns and developmental abnormalities, unlike those typically produced by ordinary environmental stress alone. These malformed spores have been discovered in widely separated regions, including Greenland, Australia, Europe, and Asia. The geographical distribution matters enormously. Local volcanic conditions might damage plant communities regionally, but a global pattern of abnormal spores points toward atmospheric disruption affecting the entire planet simultaneously. Without sufficient ozone protection, increased ultraviolet B radiation would have reached Earth's surface in far greater intensity. UVB damages DNA directly, interfering with cellular reproduction and increasing mutation rates. Organisms already stressed by unstable climates and toxic chemistry would have faced additional biological strain simply from exposure to sunlight. Plants were particularly vulnerable because they formed the foundation of terrestrial food webs while remaining continuously exposed at the surface. Forest recovery became more difficult when reproductive structures themselves suffered radiation damage. Reduced plant productivity also affected herbivores already struggling within ecosystems destabilized by drought, acid rain, and shifting temperatures. Marine organisms near the ocean surface likely experienced similar stress. Planktonic communities, especially photosynthetic microorganisms drifting within the sunlit upper ocean, depend on stable light conditions for survival. Increased ultraviolet radiation may have disrupted these primary producers at the very base of marine ecosystems already weakened by warming and acidification. What emerges from the evidence is a picture of overlapping environmental assaults operating simultaneously rather than independently. Atmospheric warming destabilized climate systems. Ocean chemistry shifted toward acidity and oxygen depletion. Toxic gases spread through air and water. On top of all this, the protective layer shielding life from ultraviolet radiation appears to have weakened significantly. The Great Dying, therefore, was not driven by a single mechanism unfolding in isolation. The Siberian eruptions triggered interconnected atmospheric and biological responses, cascading through the Earth system at once. Organisms surviving one stress encountered another before recovery became possible. The biosphere endured not one catastrophe, but multiple forms of environmental instability layered together across thousands of generations. The silence after the extinction lasted far longer than the extinction itself. When the worst phases of the Great Dying finally passed, the Earth did not bloom back into abundance. The early Triassic world remained sparse and unstable, as though the biosphere had survived the catastrophe only in its thinnest and most exhausted form. Rocks from this interval carry an unusual emptiness. Paleontologists studying early Triassic sediments repeatedly encounter the same pattern across continents and oceans. Diversity collapses into monotony. A few species appear again and again in overwhelming numbers, while most former lineages simply vanish from the record. Ecosystems that once contained intricate networks of predators, grazers, reef builders, scavengers, and microorganisms became biologically simplified to an extraordinary degree. Among terrestrial vertebrates, Lystrosaurus dominated many landscapes almost alone. Small archosaurs moved through damaged habitats where larger competitors had disappeared. Ferns spread across disturbed ground, thriving temporarily in unstable environments where forests had not yet returned. These communities are sometimes called disaster faunas, assemblages shaped less by ecological richness than by the ability to endure ecological ruin. Even many survivors did not truly survive for long. Paleontologists use the phrase dead clades walking to describe lineages that crossed the extinction boundary but failed to establish lasting recoveries afterward. These organisms persisted briefly into the Triassic before disappearing entirely, remnants of once successful groups lingering for a geological moment before fading away. Their existence gives the extinction a prolonged quality, as though the collapse continued echoing through generations after the initial catastrophe. Evidence also suggests the environmental instability itself did not fully cease. Within the first several million years of the Triassic, additional extinction pulses disrupted ecosystems already struggling to recover. Continued phases of Siberian volcanism may have contributed to these recurring crises, repeatedly interrupting attempts at biological rebuilding. The atmosphere and oceans remained chemically unsettled long after the initial extinction interval ended. Marine recovery proceeded, especially slowly. Complex reef ecosystems vanished from the fossil record for millions of years. Before the extinction, coral and sponge reefs stretched across shallow tropical seas, supporting dense communities of fish, invertebrates, and microorganisms. Afterward came the reef gap, a prolonged interval during which such structures almost entirely disappeared from the planet. In some regions, fully developed reefs did not return for roughly 10 million years. The surviving organisms themselves also changed in scale. Across many lineages, body size decreased dramatically during the early Triassic, a pattern known as the Lilliput effect. Descendants of previously larger animals appeared in dwarfed forms, likely shaped by unstable food supplies, environmental stress, and oxygen limitations. Smaller bodies required fewer resources and allowed faster reproduction within ecosystems where energy remained scarce. The atmosphere of the early Triassic world was therefore not one of renewal, but of persistence. Forests remained fragmented, oceans still carried signs of chemical instability. Biodiversity stayed low for spans longer than the entire history of human civilization many times over. Evolution continued, but cautiously, within ecosystems stripped down to their simplest functioning forms. Seen through the fossil record, the aftermath resembles less a clean beginning than a prolonged convalescence. Life remained present almost everywhere, yet the planet itself seemed biologically subdued, as though the Earth had survived the catastrophe physically while still struggling to remember how to become fully alive again. In the long quiet that followed the extinction, the Earth did not immediately belong to dinosaurs. For millions of years, the planet remained biologically sparse, populated by scattered survivors moving through unstable climates and simplified ecosystems. Yet within that wounded world, evolutionary paths that once seemed insignificant slowly widened into dominance. Before the catastrophe, the synapsids had ruled terrestrial ecosystems for roughly 50 million years. Their lineages occupied nearly every major ecological role on land. Massive herbivores moved through Permian floodplains and dry interiors, while saber-toothed gorgonopsids hunted across the supercontinent with the confidence of creatures shaped by immense evolutionary success. The balance of the terrestrial biosphere rested largely within synapsid hands. The Great Dying shattered that structure. Entire predator lineages disappeared. Many herbivorous forms collapsed alongside them. The extinction removed not merely individual species, but entire frameworks of ecological interaction that had stabilized over millions of years. When recovery finally began, much of the old hierarchy no longer existed. Among the survivors were small archosaurs, animals that had once occupied relatively modest positions in Permian ecosystems. In earlier ages, they had lived in the margins beside far more dominant synapsid groups. Their bodies were generally leaner, their postures more upright, their physiology suited to endurance within difficult environments. During the unstable conditions of the early Triassic, these characteristics became increasingly valuable. As ecosystems slowly reopened, archosaurs diversified into newly vacant niches. Some evolved into swift terrestrial predators, others adapted to herbivory or small prey hunting. Their expansion was not explosive at first. It unfolded gradually across landscapes still marked by ecological simplicity. Rivers shifted through broad, barren plains, while scattered forests cautiously returned. And within those recovering habitats, archosaurs multiplied generation after generation. By the Middle and Late Triassic, one archosaur branch had begun separating itself from the rest. These were the earliest dinosaurs, initially small animals whose significance would have been impossible to recognize at the beginning of their history. They did not emerge by overpowering a healthy synapsid world. They emerged because the older order had already been devastated. This distinction matters deeply within the history of life. The dinosaurs inherited ecological opportunity from catastrophe. Had the Permian extinction been less severe, surviving synapsid groups might have reclaimed dominance during recovery, leaving little room for archosaurs to radiate so extensively. Evolution often depends less on superiority than on timing, survival, and the sudden absence of competitors. From that altered beginning came one of the longest reigning dynasties the Earth has ever known. Dinosaurs would dominate terrestrial ecosystems for approximately 165 million years, spreading across every continent and diversifying into forms ranging from delicate feathered hunters to animals heavier than modern whales. One surviving lineage eventually transformed further into birds, carrying dinosaur ancestry into the modern sky. The chain of consequence stretches astonishingly far across geological time. A volcanic province erupting in Siberia reshaped atmospheric chemistry, oceans, climates, and ecosystems, yet it also quietly redirected the future trajectory of evolution itself. The world of the Jurassic, the age of giant sauropods, the rise of birds, and even the ecological conditions that later allowed mammals to flourish after the dinosaurs, all trace part of their origin back to the biological emptiness left behind at the Permian boundary. In that sense, the Siberian Traps did more than destroy an ancient world. They reorganized the possibilities of every world that followed. Far beyond Siberia, scattered across different ages of Earth history, there are other places where the crust once opened on a continental scale. They lie separated by oceans and millions of years, yet the rocks speak with a strangely similar voice. Thick basalt plateaus, abrupt chemical disturbances, darkened sediments, disrupted ecosystems, extinction boundaries. Again and again, the same sequence appears, as though the planet has repeated variations of a single catastrophic experiment across deep time. Approximately 201 million years ago, near the end of the Triassic period, another immense volcanic province emerged as the supercontinent Pangaea began slowly tearing apart. This was the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, now fragmented across eastern North America, northwestern Africa, South America, and Western Europe by the later opening of the Atlantic Ocean. At the time of eruption, however, these regions formed a connected volcanic landscape stretching across enormous distances. The timing aligns almost perfectly with the end Triassic extinction, the fourth largest biological crisis in Earth history. Carbon isotope excursions appear once more in the rock record, signaling rapid injections of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Ocean chemistry shifted. Ecological instability spread across marine and terrestrial systems. Many large amphibians and reptilian competitors disappeared, while early dinosaurs survived and expanded into newly emptied ecosystems. The pattern carries an unsettling familiarity. Another chapter unfolded approximately 66 million years ago in what is now India. There, the Deccan Traps released vast quantities of basaltic lava over hundreds of thousands of years. These eruptions overlapped closely with the end Cretaceous extinction, the event most famous for ending the reign of the non-avian dinosaurs. Unlike the Permian catastrophe, this extinction also involved a confirmed asteroid impact at Chicxulub in present-day Mexico. Yet the volcanic contribution remains deeply significant. Sulfur gases, carbon dioxide, and repeated eruptive pulses likely destabilized climate systems before and after the impact itself, weakening ecosystems already under stress. Earlier still, around 183 million years ago, the Karoo-Ferrar volcanic province spread across parts of ancient Gondwana. This interval corresponds with the Torsian Oceanic anoxic event, a period marked by widespread oxygen depletion in the oceans, major warming, and marine extinction. Black shales accumulated across seafloors as stagnant waters expanded once again through marine basins. The rhythm of volcanic disturbance, followed by ecological collapse, appears with remarkable consistency. When geologists compare these events together, the statistical pattern becomes difficult to dismiss. At least 4 of the 5 major mass extinctions in Earth history coincide closely with large igneous province eruptions. The connection is no longer viewed as speculative coincidence within much of the geological community. Instead, these volcanic provinces are increasingly understood as one of the primary engines of planetary scale extinction. Not every large igneous province produces equal devastation. The lethality depends on several intertwined conditions. Eruption rate matters greatly, since rapid gas release overwhelms climate systems more effectively than slow volcanism spread across longer intervals. Total eruptive volume shapes the scale of atmospheric disruption. The composition of the crust also matters profoundly. Magma intruding into coal beds, evaporites, or organic rich sediments releases additional greenhouse and toxic gases beyond the volcanic emissions alone. The Siberian Traps combined all of these factors in the worst possible arrangement. It was the largest known large igneous province, erupting through immense buried reservoirs of carbon and sulfur compounds on a supercontinent whose geography already favored climatic extremes. The result was not simply another volcanic episode in Earth history. It became the clearest expression of how profoundly the deep interior of the planet can reshape the living surface above it. Far north in central Siberia, beyond the dense reach of most roads and cities, the land rises into a plateau shaped not by mountains folding upward, but by lava settling layer upon layer across immense spans of time. The Putarana Plateau appears from the air almost geometric in form, its flat surfaces and descending cliffs arranged like giant stairways fading into mist and tundra. This is the modern face of the Siberian Traps, quiet now beneath snow, forest, and Arctic light. The plateau reaches elevations of approximately 1,700 meters above sea level, yet its height was not built in a single upheaval. It accumulated gradually through repeated volcanic floods, each eruptive pulse spreading basalt across the surface before cooling into stone. Over hundreds of thousands of years, the flows stacked atop one another until entire regions became buried beneath kilometers of hardened lava. The name traps comes from the Swedish word trappa, meaning stairs, and nowhere is that shape more visible than here. Long escarpments descend in broad terraces toward surrounding lowlands, creating a landscape of immense horizontal distance rather than jagged vertical peaks. In winter, the steppes disappear beneath snowfields and frozen haze. During summer, brief green tundra spreads across the dark volcanic rock, while waterfalls plunge from cliff edges into narrow canyons below. Rivers have spent millions of years cutting downward through the basalt, exposing the hidden anatomy of the eruptions themselves. Within the canyon walls, individual lava flows become visible as stacked bands of dark stone. Some layers are only a few meters thick. Others extend for tens of meters, before another boundary appears above them. Each band represents a separate volcanic event, another interval when magma reached the surface and spread outward across the ancient continent. In the deepest sections, the accumulated basalt reaches thicknesses of approximately 6,500 meters. It is difficult to comprehend such scale physically. Entire mountain ranges could disappear within a volume of lava that large. The rock beneath the Putarana Plateau is not merely a surface deposit. It is a vast geological archive preserving the chronology of one of the most transformative intervals in Earth history. Today, the region remains among the most isolated places on the planet. Boreal forests stretch across lower elevations, while tundra dominates the colder uplands. Reindeer move through valleys carved into volcanic stone. Lakes occupy ancient depressions left behind by erosion and glaciation. Human settlement is sparse, limited by climate, remoteness, and difficult terrain. For much of the year, silence dominates the plateau, except for wind, water, and migrating animals crossing enormous distances. Scientists travel into this isolation, carrying drills capable of extracting cylindrical cores from deep within the basalt layers. These cores contain mineral crystals, trapped gases, and magnetic signatures that preserve information from the eruptions themselves. By studying them, researchers reconstruct eruption timing, lava chemistry, atmospheric conditions, and even aspects of ancient climate. The stone still holds measurable traces of a catastrophe that unfolded 252 million years ago. To stand upon the Putarana Plateau is to stand atop the cooled remains of a planetary wound. The eruptions have long since ceased. No lava rises now through the crust beneath Siberia. The immense volcanic engine exhausted itself millions of years before human beings existed to imagine it. Yet the land still carries the shape of that violence in every cliff, canyon, and dark basalt terrace stretching toward the polar horizon. Deep beneath the language of fossils and lava flows lies another kind of record, quieter and more exacting, written not in bones or landscapes, but inside crystals, smaller than grains of sand. The story of the Siberian Traps depends not only on discovering what happened, but on determining precisely when it happened. In geology, time is rarely measured directly. It is reconstructed from subtle physical changes unfolding atom by atom across immense spans of Earth history. One of the most powerful methods relies on zircon crystals formed within volcanic ash. When zircon crystallizes from molten material, uranium atoms become locked inside its crystal lattice. Lead atoms do not. This distinction matters profoundly because uranium is unstable. Over time, it decays at a constant and measurable rate into lead through radioactive transformation. By measuring the ratio between remaining uranium and accumulated lead inside a zircon crystal, scientists can calculate how long ago the crystal formed. Zircon is exceptionally valuable because it survives geological punishment remarkably well. Heat, pressure, groundwater, and tectonic deformation often alter surrounding minerals over hundreds of millions of years, yet zircon frequently preserves its internal chemistry intact. Some crystals on Earth are more than 4 billion years old, carrying within them timestamps from the planet's earliest history. In volcanic ash layers associated with the Permian extinction, zircons became tiny clocks embedded within catastrophe itself. Modern uranium-lead dating has reached extraordinary precision. For rocks approximately 252 million years old, uncertainty can be reduced to roughly 20,000 to 50,000 years. Across the scale of deep time, this represents astonishing accuracy, approximately 1/100%. Such precision allows scientists to compare eruptive pulses, extinction intervals, ocean chemistry changes, and climate disruptions within increasingly narrow windows of geological time. Not all volcanic rocks contain zircon crystals, particularly basaltic lava flows, like those dominating the Siberian Traps. In those cases, researchers often use argon. This technique measures the radioactive decay of potassium-40 into argon-40 trapped within minerals as lava cools and solidifies. While different in method, it serves the same purpose, transforming radioactive decay into a measurable chronology of eruption and cooling. Other methods contribute independent lines of evidence. Paleomagnetic dating uses the fact that magnetic minerals align themselves with Earth's magnetic field while lava remains molten. Because the planet's magnetic poles have reversed many times throughout geological history, preserved magnetic orientations inside ancient basalt can be matched against known reversal timescales. The cooling lava effectively records the direction of the ancient magnetic field at the moment of solidification. Astrochronology adds another layer of timing. Sedimentary rocks often preserve rhythmic cycles linked to gradual variations in Earth's orbit and axial tilt, known as Milankovitch cycles. These orbital shifts alter climate patterns and sediment deposition in predictable intervals. By matching repeating sedimentary rhythms to orbital calculations, scientists construct additional chronological frameworks independent of radiometric dating itself. What gives confidence to the Siberian Traps timeline is not any single technique alone, but the convergence of many unrelated methods pointing toward the same sequence of events. Radiometric measurements, magnetic signatures, orbital cycles, volcanic ash layers, and extinction horizons align with remarkable consistency across widely separated regions of the world. The result is something rare in the study of deep time. The age of the Permian-Triassic catastrophe is not a vague approximation fading into geological uncertainty. It stands as one of the most precisely constrained moments in the ancient history of the Earth, a fixed point where chemistry, biology, volcanism, and time itself intersect within the stone. Numbers often become strangely weightless when they grow too large. A mountain can be imagined because it has shape and shadow. An ocean can be imagined because it moves beneath light and weather. But extinction on the scale of the Great Dying resists ordinary intuition. The figures become so immense that they drift beyond normal human experience, dissolving into abstraction unless held carefully against the living world they describe. Before the Permian-Triassic extinction, the oceans contained approximately 300 marine invertebrate families. Within those families lived thousands upon thousands of individual species, each occupying a precise ecological role refined through millions of years of evolution. Brachiopods filtered nutrients from seawater across shallow continental shelves. Crinoids lifted feathered arms into ocean currents. Trilobites moved across seafloors already ancient, long before the first dinosaurs would exist. Reef systems stretched through warm marine basins with immense structural complexity, supporting intricate food webs that had stabilized over geological ages. After the extinction, only around 120 marine families remained. Even this number conceals the true severity of the collapse. In taxonomy, a family can survive while nearly all its constituent species vanish. A lineage containing 20 species may lose 19 and still appear in broad counts as technically surviving. The family persists statistically while its biological richness has been almost entirely erased. When paleontologists estimate total species loss, the scale becomes even more severe. Approximately 96% of marine species disappeared during the crisis. On land, the losses were somewhat lower, but still catastrophic across vertebrates, insects, and plant communities. The biosphere did not merely contract, it was stripped down to a narrow remnant of its former complexity. Scientists estimate that before the extinction, Earth may have supported hundreds of thousands of species of complex life. Afterward, the number may have fallen below 10,000. Forest ecosystems collapsed, reef systems vanished, food chains shortened dramatically, entire ecological strategies disappeared from the planet, some permanently. The surviving biosphere resembled not a functioning replacement for the old world, but a skeletal framework barely maintaining continuity between past and future life. Recovery unfolded with immense slowness. Marine ecosystems required roughly 10 million years to regain diversity levels comparable to those before the extinction. Some terrestrial systems may have taken even longer to fully stabilize. 10 million years exceeds the entire history of the genus Homo. Every human civilization, every language, every city, every memory of agriculture or written history occupies only a tiny fraction of that recovery interval. Across the broader history of life, the five major mass extinctions each forced evolution to begin rebuilding from diminished foundations. Yet the Permian-Triassic catastrophe drove biodiversity lower than any other known extinction event. It reset the biological complexity of Earth further back than any crisis before or since. Modern ecosystems still carry the consequences of that bottleneck. Every forest, coral reef, grassland, bird, mammal, flowering plant, and fungal network existing today traces its ancestry through the comparatively tiny collection of organisms that endured the extinction interval. The continuity of life was never completely broken, but it narrowed to an astonishing degree. The Great Dying, therefore, remains present in every modern ecosystem not as a distant memory, but as an inherited condition. The living Earth of today emerged from that filtration. Every surviving lineage is, in some sense, evidence that somewhere within the collapsing Permian world, a small population endured long enough to pass life forward into another age. Extinction has visited Earth more than once. The fossil record preserves several moments where diversity narrowed sharply and familiar ecosystems disappeared into stone. Yet when paleontologists compare these crises across deep time, the Permian-Triassic boundary rises apart from the others with an unsettling clarity, not merely larger in scale, but different in character, as though the planet briefly crossed into environmental conditions rarely approached before or since. The end Ordovician extinction, approximately 444 million years ago, removed around 85% of species, primarily marine life inhabiting shallow continental seas. Ice sheets expanded across the southern hemisphere, sea levels fell, and ocean habitats contracted rapidly. Severe as the losses were, the crisis unfolded within systems still capable of comparatively swift recovery once climatic conditions stabilized. Marine ecosystems reorganized themselves over the following millions of years, with much of their structural complexity intact. The late Devonian extinction, beginning roughly 375 million years ago, was more prolonged. Biodiversity declined through multiple pulses stretched across an extended interval rather than a single concentrated collapse. Reef communities suffered heavily, particularly armored fish and shallow marine organisms, yet large portions of terrestrial ecosystems remained comparatively resilient. The biosphere weakened, but it did not descend into near total systemic failure. At the end of the Triassic, approximately 201 million years ago, another immense volcanic province erupted as the supercontinent Pangaea began to fracture. The Central Atlantic Magmatic Province released enormous volumes of lava and greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, driving climatic instability and widespread extinction. Roughly 80% of species disappeared. Even so, recovery proceeded more effectively than after the Permian catastrophe, and many ecological networks retained surviving foundations from which rebuilding could begin. The end Cretaceous extinction, 66 million years ago, remains the most culturally familiar because it ended the reign of the non-avian dinosaurs. Around 76% of species vanished after the Chicxulub asteroid impact, likely intensified by volcanism from the Deccan Traps. Darkness, firestorms, and abrupt climatic disruption reshaped global ecosystems. Yet oceans retained more oxygen than during the Permian collapse. Forests eventually regenerated, and complex food webs returned on shorter geological timescales. Then comes the Great Dying. Approximately 96% of marine species vanished. Around 70% of terrestrial vertebrate species disappeared alongside immense losses among insects, plants, fungi, and microbial communities. Entire evolutionary lineages that had persisted for hundreds of millions of years ended permanently. More striking still was the speed. The most acute biological collapse may have unfolded within only tens of thousands of years, geologically almost instantaneous. What made this extinction uniquely severe was the convergence of multiple amplifying conditions within the Permian world itself. Pangaea formed a vast continental interior, vulnerable to violent seasonal extremes and reduced coastal moderation. Beneath Siberia lay immense coal and evaporite deposits that transformed volcanism into a colossal release of additional greenhouse and halogen gases. Global temperatures were already relatively warm before the eruptions intensified further heating. Ocean circulation weakened, oxygen declined, acidification spread through marine systems already stressed near physiological limits. Most critically, the eruptions endured for nearly 1 million years. Recovery repeatedly began and repeatedly failed. Ecosystems never received the long, quiet intervals necessary for stabilization. Each surviving refuge remained exposed to renewed chemical disruption before complexity could return. Other extinctions shattered ecosystems. The Permian-Triassic extinction dismantled the underlying environmental conditions that made complex ecosystems possible in the first place. Long after the Siberian Traps became the leading explanation for the Great Dying, a quieter uncertainty continued to drift through paleontology and geology. The extinction seemed almost impossibly severe, too sudden in places, too complete across both ocean and land. Some researchers wondered whether volcanism alone, even at such extraordinary scale, could truly account for the collapse recorded in the rocks. In that uncertainty, another possibility emerged from the shadows of Earth history: the possibility of an impact from space arriving at the same moment the planet was already unraveling. The idea carried obvious echoes of the end Cretaceous extinction. By the late 20th century, the Chicxulub impact had transformed scientific understanding of catastrophe. A single asteroid strike had ended the age of the non-avian dinosaurs, leaving behind unmistakable evidence distributed worldwide. If one extinction had involved an impact, perhaps the largest extinction of all had as well. Researchers began searching the Permian-Triassic boundary for similar signals. One of the first clues examined was iridium, a metal rare in Earth's crust but comparatively abundant in meteorites. At the Cretaceous boundary, iridium concentrations spike dramatically in sediments across the globe. At the Permian boundary, iridium exists only in faint amounts, detectable but far weaker, orders of magnitude below the levels associated with Chicxulub. The signal suggested that if an impact occurred, it was either far smaller or preserved very differently. Attention then turned toward shocked quartz and microscopic impact spherules, materials created under the immense pressures generated by asteroid collisions. At confirmed impact boundaries, these features appear abundantly and consistently. In Permian-Triassic rocks, the evidence remained uncertain. Some grains appeared suggestive, others proved inconclusive under closer examination. Many proposed impact markers could not be reproduced reliably across different boundary sites. For a brief period in the early 2000s, a more exotic possibility stirred excitement. Scientists reported the discovery of fullerenes, hollow carbon molecules, sometimes called buckyballs, containing helium-3 and argon isotopes associated with extraterrestrial material. The findings implied that traces of cosmic matter might truly exist within the extinction layer, yet subsequent studies struggled to replicate the results consistently. Some samples failed contamination tests. Others produced contradictory measurements. The evidence gradually lost much of its earlier force. A potential crater added another chapter to the debate. Off the northwestern coast of Australia lies a submerged geological structure known as the Bedout High. In 2004, several researchers proposed it as a possible impact scar dating to the Permian-Triassic boundary. If correct, it could have represented the missing crater connected to the extinction. Later analyses, however, questioned both the structure's age and its interpretation as an impact feature. Many geologists now regard the evidence as insufficient. As the decades passed, the volcanism model strengthened rather than weakened. Improved radiometric dating aligned the eruption pulses of the Siberian Traps closely with the extinction interval. Mercury anomalies, carbon isotope shifts, warming patterns, ocean anoxia, ozone depletion, and thermogenic gas release formed an interconnected chain of evidence capable of explaining the catastrophe without assistance from an asteroid. The question has never vanished entirely. Deep time rarely preserves every wound with equal clarity. Erosion removes evidence. Tectonic plates recycle the crust. Oceans close and mountains rise. Yet the broader picture now points overwhelmingly toward a planet undone primarily by its own internal forces, by fire emerging from beneath the crust rather than from the darkness beyond it. In laboratories filled with isotope charts, sediment cores, and climate simulations glowing across quiet computer screens, the Siberian Traps no longer exists only as a vanished volcanic province from deep time. It has become something more intimate to modern science, a physical archive of how planetary systems respond when carbon enters the atmosphere faster than ecosystems can absorb the shock. The rocks of the Permian-Triassic boundary are studied not simply to understand extinction, but to understand process, sequence, and consequence. The eruptions in Siberia released carbon dioxide over approximately 1 million years. That duration matters deeply. Earth possesses natural buffering systems, weathering reactions in rock, carbon burial in sediments, absorption by oceans and forests. But these systems operate slowly, often across tens or hundreds of thousands of years. When greenhouse gases enter the atmosphere faster than those mechanisms can compensate, imbalance accumulates, temperature rises, ocean chemistry shifts. Oxygen circulation weakens, ecological stability begins to narrow. Modern industrial civilization is releasing carbon at a dramatically faster pace. The total quantities differ, and scientists are careful not to collapse those differences into simplistic equivalents, yet the rate itself has become central to climate research. Carbon injected across centuries produces different biological pressures than carbon released gradually across geological epochs. Species, coastlines, ocean systems, and atmospheric circulation patterns have less time to adjust before new conditions arrive. One of the clearest modern parallels appears in the oceans. Since the beginning of the industrial era, average ocean pH has declined by approximately zero point 0.1 units. The numerical change appears small, yet, because the pH scale is logarithmic, it represents a substantial increase in acidity. Geological evidence suggests the current pace of acidification may be the fastest experienced in at least 300 million years. In the Permian seas, similar chemical changes weakened shell-forming organisms and destabilized reef ecosystems that depended upon calcium carbonate structures remaining chemically stable. Ocean warming provides another echo from deep time. As seawater absorbs excess heat, dissolved oxygen declines. Warm water holds less oxygen than cold water, and altered circulation reduces mixing between surface and deep ocean layers. Researchers studying Permian-Triassic sediments find evidence for precisely these conditions, expanding anoxic zones, disrupted marine ecosystems, and microbial communities flourishing where oxygen-dependent animals disappeared. Modern oceans remain far from those extreme states, yet the mechanisms themselves are not theoretical. They are observable, measurable, and preserved in ancient stone. For this reason, paleontologists increasingly work alongside climate scientists, geochemists, and oceanographers. Data extracted from fossil shells, carbon isotopes, mercury spikes, and ancient sediments help calibrate climate models designed to simulate long-term Earth system behavior. The Permian-Triassic extinction provides a rare, full-scale example of how warming, acidification, atmospheric chemistry, and ecological stress interact simultaneously rather than independently. The Great Dying is therefore approached carefully within science. It is not treated as prophecy, nor as a direct blueprint for the modern world. The continents are arranged differently now. Ocean gateways differ. Ice, sheets, ecosystems, and atmospheric conditions are not the same, yet the underlying physics and chemistry remain governed by the same planet. In that sense, the Siberian Traps has become less a relic of vanished catastrophe and more a vast geological laboratory, one that continues to speak through oxygen atoms, carbon ratios, and layers of basalt laid down long before humanity appeared to read them. The Great Dying did not reveal itself all at once. Its story emerged slowly, assembled from scattered cliffs, drill cores, fossil beds, and mineral grains collected across continents by people separated not only by geography, but by generations. Long before the extinction acquired its modern name, fragments of its evidence already rested quietly inside museum drawers and field notebooks, waiting for the sciences of geology and paleontology to become precise enough to read them clearly. In the late 19th century, the Scottish geologist Charles Lapworth studied ancient volcanic terrains layered across parts of Britain. In 1879, his descriptions of immense basalt formations helped establish the conceptual foundations for what would later be recognized as large igneous provinces. The term itself did not yet exist. The deeper connection between flood basalts and extinction remained invisible, yet the first outlines of the puzzle had entered scientific thought. Decades later, across the immense northern interior of the Soviet Union, another chapter began. During the mid-20th century, Soviet geologists undertook the difficult mapping of Siberia's volcanic plateaus. Among them, Vladimir Sobolev and his colleagues revealed the astonishing scale of the Siberian Traps themselves. The basalt layers stretched across distances so large they challenged earlier assumptions about volcanism. These were not ordinary eruptions concentrated around a volcanic cone. They represented something planetary in scale, lava fields vast enough to alter atmospheric chemistry. By the 1990s, new techniques in geochemistry and sediment analysis allowed researchers to move beyond description into mechanism. Paul Wignall and Richard Twitchett published influential work in 1996 demonstrating widespread oceanic anoxia across the Permian-Triassic boundary. Dark marine sediments, depleted oxygen signatures, and disrupted ecosystems pointed towards suffocating oceans on a global scale. The extinction was no longer viewed simply as biological disappearance. It became an environmental systems collapse. Soon afterward, Samuel Bowring and collaborators transformed the timeline itself. Using high-precision uranium-lead dating of zircon crystals preserved within volcanic ash layers, they demonstrated that the Siberian eruptions and the extinction interval aligned extraordinarily closely in time. Deep history, once blurry across millions of years, suddenly sharpened into windows measurable within a few 100,000 years, later refined further still. Other researchers carried the story outward into public understanding. Peter Ward helped popularize the term Great Dying, bringing the catastrophe into broader cultural awareness while also advancing scientific debate surrounding hydrogen sulfide poisoning and atmospheric toxicity. The extinction ceased to be an obscure geological boundary known mainly to specialists. It became recognized as the most severe biological crisis in the history of complex life. In the following decades, scientists, including Seth Burgess, investigated the role of coal and evaporite intrusions beneath Siberia, showing how magma interacting with buried sediments multiplied greenhouse gas release far beyond volcanism alone. At the same time, Xuzhong Shen and colleagues working at Meishan in China produced the most detailed stratigraphic record of the extinction ever assembled, narrowing its timing with remarkable precision. No single discovery solved the Great Dying. The picture emerged through accumulated labor, through decades spent measuring isotopes, splitting shale, tracing fossils through cliff faces, and comparing data gathered from remote corners of the world. The extinction itself lasted only a geological instant. Understanding it required more than a century of patient human attention. Some extinctions remove branches from the tree of life. The Great Dying came close to cutting through the trunk itself. Beneath the statistics of vanished species and collapsed ecosystems lies a quieter realization, one difficult to hold steadily in the mind for long, that many of the lineages now familiar on Earth survived the Permian-Triassic boundary by margins so narrow they are almost invisible in the fossil record. Among those lineages were the synapsids, the distant evolutionary group from which mammals would eventually emerge. Long before fur, milk, or primates existed, synapsids already dominated terrestrial ecosystems across the Permian world. They occupied predator roles, herbivore niches, and broad ecological territories for tens of millions of years. Then the extinction arrived and erased most of them almost completely. Entire families disappeared. Apex predators vanished without descendants. The lineage endured only through a handful of battered survivors scattered through devastated landscapes. The closeness of that survival matters. Had the environmental collapse deepened slightly further, had temperatures climbed a little higher, had the oxygen decline persisted a little longer, the synapsid branch might have ended permanently in the early Triassic. In that alternate history, mammals never appear. Forest canopies never hold primates. Human beings never emerge to reconstruct the catastrophe from stone 252 million years later. The ammonoids offer another glimpse into the fragility of survival. Before the extinction, they flourished through ancient oceans in extraordinary diversity, their coiled shells drifting through marine ecosystems across the globe. The Permian catastrophe nearly erased them completely. Evidence suggests perhaps a single surviving genus passed through the extinction bottleneck. From that tiny remnant, evolution unfolded outward once more during the Triassic, producing hundreds of new species in one of paleontology's most remarkable recoveries. Their eventual disappearance at the end Cretaceous lay far in the future. For millions of years after the Great Dying, the oceans belonged partly to descendants of a lineage that had nearly vanished entirely. These histories reveal the deeper principle paleontologists call evolutionary contingency. Life does not move toward predetermined outcomes. Complex organisms do not inevitably emerge from catastrophe stronger than before. Evolutionary history is shaped by timing, geography, chemistry, and accident. A burrow deep enough to escape surface heat, a coastline cool enough to preserve dissolved oxygen, a metabolism tolerant of starvation for slightly longer than competing species. Survival often depended not on superiority, but on circumstance. The fossil record preserves many examples of dominant organisms disappearing while smaller, seemingly insignificant forms endured. During the early Triassic, creatures like Lystrosaurus spread across barren continents not because they were the pinnacle of Permian evolution, but because they happened to possess traits suited to instability, rapid reproduction, flexible diets, and refuge seeking behavior. The world belonged temporarily to the adaptable rather than the specialized. Even that outcome balanced on uncertain ground. Continued eruptive pulses from the Siberian Traps persisted into the recovery interval. Another sufficiently severe climatic shock during those fragile first millions of years might have eliminated the remaining synapsids altogether. The chain leading toward mammals would have snapped before it fully formed. When viewed across geological time, the endurance of complex land life appears less secure than everyday existence suggests. The continuity between the Permian world and the present survives through an astonishingly thin corridor of contingency, preserved not by inevitability, but by survival, occurring just often enough in just enough places for the story of life to continue. Numbers this large become strangely weightless in the human mind. 252 million years feels less like time than abstraction, a distance too immense for ordinary memory or instinct to hold. Human experience is measured in seasons, lifetimes, generations. Deep time unfolds on scales where continents drift apart, oceans appear and vanish, and entire branches of life rise slowly into dominance before disappearing again into stone. One way scientists try to grasp this immensity is by compressing Earth's history into a single calendar year. In that imagined scale, the planet forms on January 1st. The earliest oceans condense months later. Complex animals do not arrive until autumn. Dinosaurs emerge near the end of December. The Permian-Triassic extinction, despite its incomprehensible antiquity, falls surprisingly late in the year, around November 13th. Modern humans appear only minutes before midnight on December 31st, occupying the final flicker of geological time. Within that same compressed calendar, the million-year duration of the Siberian Traps eruption would last roughly 2 hours. For nearly the span of an evening, lava would continue flooding across northern Pangaea, while atmospheric chemistry shifted, oceans stagnated, and ecosystems weakened in repeated waves. The eruption itself would outlast the entire existence of humanity many times over, yet from the perspective of geology, it would still count as abrupt. The 5 great mass extinctions would all cluster within the final weeks of the year, after complex life had already flourished for hundreds of millions of years. This concentration reveals something important about the history of Earth. Deep time is not an empty wilderness of barren rock waiting for humans to arrive. It is crowded with vanished biospheres, each containing forests, coastlines, migrations, predator-prey relationships, reproductive cycles, and ecological balances every bit as intricate as those of the modern world. The Permian Earth was not a primitive rehearsal for later ages. Its ecosystems had already evolved through immense spans of time. Reef systems stretched through warm seas. Vast inland environments supported complex terrestrial food webs. Insects filled the air. Synapsids crossed floodplains and fern forests beneath unfamiliar constellations. Life then possessed the same immediacy life possesses now. Creatures searched for food, defended territory, reproduced, and struggled through changing seasons under skies they could not understand. What disappeared during the Great Dying was therefore more than a collection of species names preserved in museum drawers. Entire ecological conversations vanished. Relationships between organisms that had developed gradually over tens of millions of years dissolved with astonishing speed. Certain evolutionary experiments ended permanently. No descendant would ever reconstruct them exactly as they once were. The fossil record preserves only fragments of that lost world, a shell pressed into limestone, a tooth embedded in shale, a pollen grain sealed within ancient sediment. These remains are not the living organisms themselves, only the durable traces left behind after flesh, behavior, sound, and movement disappeared. Paleontology reconstructs vanished worlds from those fragments with extraordinary care, yet the actual living presence of the Permian can never fully return. Stone remembers chemistry with remarkable precision. It remembers temperature, atmospheric carbon, volcanic metals, and the timing of extinction pulses. Yet beneath all those measurements lies something quieter, the recognition that nearly every world Earth has ever contained has already vanished, leaving only a thin mineral outline of lives once fully lived. A mountain range seems permanent when viewed from the span of a human life. Oceans appear eternal, climates dependable, forests self-renewing. Yet the Permian-Triassic extinction reveals a quieter truth beneath that sense of stability. Earth is not fixed. It is a network of interacting systems balanced delicately across immense stretches of time, each process depending on the others in ways that are often invisible until the balance fails. Long before the first lava reached the surface in Siberia, the planet already possessed mechanisms that regulated climate and chemistry. Carbon moved continuously between atmosphere, ocean, rock, and living tissue. Ocean currents transported oxygen through the depths. Forests stabilized soil and moisture across continents. High above the surface, ozone filtered dangerous ultraviolet radiation before it could damage exposed organisms. These systems did not operate separately. They functioned together, linked through countless exchanges of heat, gas, minerals, and biological activity. Among the most important of these stabilizing processes was the silicate weathering feedback, Earth's slow geological thermostat. When atmospheric carbon dioxide rises, global temperatures increase. Warmer temperatures accelerate rainfall and chemical weathering, particularly the breakdown of silicate rocks exposed on continents. That weathering gradually removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and locks it into minerals and marine sediments. Over hundreds of thousands of years, the planet normally corrects itself through this immense chemical cycle. The Siberian Traps overwhelmed even that mechanism. Carbon entered the atmosphere faster than long-term weathering could compensate. The usual balancing systems remained active, but they could no longer keep pace with the scale of disruption. Geological evidence suggests that once certain thresholds were crossed, additional failures followed in sequence. Ocean circulation weakened as temperature contrasts between equator and poles diminished. Oxygen levels in deep water collapsed. Methane, stored in seafloor sediments, may have destabilized and entered the atmosphere, intensifying warming further. Halogen gases damaged the ozone layer, exposing terrestrial ecosystems to elevated ultraviolet radiation, Each destabilized system amplified stress in the next. Modern climate science describes such moments as tipping points, thresholds beyond which recovery toward the previous state becomes increasingly difficult. In the Permian world, these tipping points were not abstract models or theoretical warnings. They became physical events preserved in sediment, isotope, chemistry, and extinction patterns. The planet crossed boundaries from which it could not immediately return, yet Earth itself endured. That endurance carries a different meaning than permanence. Over millions of years, atmospheric chemistry gradually stabilized. Weathering continued its slow work across exposed rock. Ocean circulation resumed. Oxygen returned to deep marine environments. Forest ecosystems spread again across the continents, and biodiversity slowly rebuilt from scattered survivors. Recovery happened not through sudden healing, but through countless incremental processes unfolding across spans of time too vast for direct human imagination. The recovered world, however, was not identical to the one that vanished. Dominant animal groups changed, ecological structures reorganized, entire evolutionary histories disappeared permanently, while others expanded into newly emptied environments. The post-Permian Earth contained different oceans, different forests, different predators, and eventually, different possibilities for life itself. The Siberian Traps therefore reveals something profound about planetary stability. Earth is resilient, but resilience does not mean preservation. Systems can survive while still becoming something entirely new. The catastrophe did not shatter the planet into ruin. It altered the trajectory of life and chemistry so completely that the world afterward became, in every ecological sense, another Earth, wearing the same continents beneath a different sky. In the layers of rock above the extinction boundary, there is a long stretch where the planet seems to speak more softly. Fossils become sparse, reef structures vanish, forest ecosystems retreat into simpler forms. The immense biological complexity that had accumulated across the Permian does not immediately return after the catastrophe passes. For millions of years, Earth carries the quietness of survival rather than abundance. The early Triassic world was inhabited largely by generalists and opportunists, organisms capable of enduring unstable climates and damaged ecosystems. Many environments contained only a handful of dominant species repeated again and again through the fossil record. Ancient floodplains that once supported varied communities became landscapes occupied by scattered survivors. In the oceans, ecological layering collapsed into simpler food webs. The planet was alive, but much of the old richness had been erased. 10 million years is difficult to imagine clearly. Entire mountain ranges can rise and erode within spans of that scale. Shorelines drift across continents. Species appear, adapt, and disappear. Yet for roughly that length of time, the biosphere remained constrained beneath the lingering effects of the Great Dying. Recovery moved slowly because recovery itself required rebuilding relationships between organisms, not merely increasing their numbers. Predators depended on prey, forests depended on stable soils and climate. Reef systems required delicate balances of chemistry, temperature, and biological cooperation. Complexity could not be restored instantly. Gradually, though, the silence began to loosen. Archosaurs, once minor reptiles within Permian ecosystems, diversified across the recovering landscapes of the Triassic. Some remained small insect hunters, moving through sparse vegetation. Others expanded into larger ecological roles, left vacant by extinct synapsid predators. Among those archosaurs appeared the first dinosaurs, initially modest animals with narrow bodies and upright limbs, not yet rulers of the planet, but participants in a slow, evolutionary reshaping already underway. The seas also regained movement and variety. Ammonoids, reduced to the edge of disappearance, radiated outward into new forms with astonishing speed. Mollusks diversified through recovering coastlines. Reef systems eventually returned, built by different groups than those that had dominated before the extinction. Forests spread again across the continents, stabilizing soils and feeding increasingly complex terrestrial ecosystems. Over immense spans of time, the world grew crowded with life once more. 252 million years later, descendants of the synapsids that survived that bottleneck learned to study the event itself. Human beings traveled into northern Siberia, drilled through basalt layers buried beneath tundra and snow, extracted cylindrical cores of volcanic rock, and measured isotope ratios within minerals formed long before mammals existed. Using chemistry, magnetism, and radioactive decay, living organisms reconstructed the near destruction of all complex life from traces preserved in stone. There is something quietly remarkable in that continuity. The extinction nearly erased the lineage from which mammals would eventually emerge, yet one branch endured long enough to become capable of understanding what almost happened. Ancient lava became data. Fossil shells became timelines. Oxygen atoms preserved temperatures from vanished oceans. Today, the Putarana Plateau rests in stillness beneath boreal forest and winter snow, its cliffs layered with basalt from eruptions unimaginably old. Rivers move through dark volcanic stone where lava once spread across the surface of Pangaea. The eruption is over, the chemistry settled, the biosphere rebuilt itself into new forms, and the living world that survived remains here still, intricate and restless beneath a sky carried forward from deep time itself.